You know things are strange when a philosopher carries more leeches than books. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we step into the chambers of medieval medicine where a diagnosis might involve the stars, a sniff of urine, and a velvet robe that meant more than a cure, a damp wooden floor, the tang of herbs in the air, and a robed figure clutching a crystal flask. This was not your average doctor's office. Here, physic meant philosophy, not pharmacology. Healing was only one theory among many, and often not the most popular. Why did patients keep coming back? What counted as better? And why did so many of these educated men prefer charts to people? If this kind of historical confusion feels more soothing than your daily to-do list, maybe give that like button a gentle tap. Subscribing helps too, especially if your humors need balancing. Sometimes I wonder, what's your favorite medieval cure? The weirder the better. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake in the half-light of a stone chamber, straw-stuffed mattress beneath you, and a chill sneaking through the cracks. Outside, bells toll, matins the hour before dawn. But inside your day begins in the most peculiar of clinics, the study of a medieval physician. He doesn't ask how you're feeling. Instead, he's busy examining a parchment sketching stars and symbols in ink that smells faintly of crushed berries. No one mentions germs. No one takes your pulse. Instead, you're asked for a vial, yes, of urine. It's held up to the light, sniffed gently, and compared to a faded chart. The color might suggest an imbalance of yellow bile, or maybe it's phlegm. Either way, something must be out of order. And so begins your journey not toward healing exactly, but toward interpretation. The medieval physician rarely worked with patients. Instead, many preferred their ivory towers, university halls where theory ruled. Physic, the term for medicine, came from Aristotle and Galen, not first-hand experience. Students memorized ancient texts in Latin, passed oral exams on the balance of humors, and earned degrees that carried more prestige than practical use. Those robes, they weren't just warm, they signaled authority. A crimson hood said, "You'd read Galen." A black gown meant you taught others to do the same. Some scholars argue these men never expected to heal anyone. Their role, perhaps, was more symbolic than scientific. Medicine in this era was closer to astrology, alchemy, and theology. To cure might mean aligning the stars or purging a melancholy temperament. Whether it worked? Well, that wasn't always the point. Still, not all was abstract. A jar of leeches sits beside the physician's desk, plump from yesterday's appointments. A basket of dried herbs lies near the hearth. Lavender for calm, sage for strength. Even these choices weren't random, each herb tied to a humor, each treatment chosen based on theory, not symptoms. You weren't a patient. You were a case study, a reflection of cosmic imbalance. And here lies the quiet irony in a world so focused on understanding the body. Medieval medicine often avoided the body itself. Scholars still debate whether this detachment protected knowledge or merely preserved ignorance. Robes don't heal fevers, but in medieval Europe they might as well have. The fancier the gown, the wiser the man, or so people believed. Step into a lecture hall, and you'll find medicine draped in velvet, not soaked in blood. The physician who greets you today is more scholar than surgeon. His robes sweep the stone floor lined with sable fur and embroidered with symbols of learning. He holds no stethoscope, only a scroll, perhaps a lecture on the melancholic effects of moonlight. Around him, young students huddle on benches, copying his words with ink-stained fingers. They've never touched a patient. Many never will. At the heart of medieval medicine stood the university. Institutions like Salerno, Montpellier, and Bologna became hubs of healing, at least in theory. Physicians there studied Latin texts, dissected Aristotle's logic more than human bodies, and ranked one another not by skill, but by scholarship. The hierarchy was ironclad. Masters lectured, bachelors debated, apprentices listened. No one questioned the chain of command. And no one, absolutely no one, got their hands dirty. This made sense in a society where class dictated everything. To treat wounds or deliver babies was the job of midwives and barbers. Practical folks often illiterate working with trial and error. Physicians, meanwhile, guarded their prestige like holy relics. The dirtier the work, the lower the status. One scholar even claimed that if a doctor actually touched a patient, it might have been considered a sign of failure. So, how did these physicians maintain authority? They looked the part. Elaborate robes, flowing beards, and an arsenal of Latin phrases made them seem almost priestly. If you couldn't cure, at least you could confuse. A well-timed quote from Galen could silence doubt quicker than any tincture. As one chronicler put it, he who spoke best was thought to heal best. Some historians remain puzzled by this link between eloquence and effectiveness, suggesting that image often overshadowed results. And then there's the matter of exams. Not practical tests, mind you, no demonstrations, no mock surgeries. Instead, students answered oral questions about bodily fluids, planetary influences, and the writings of ancient Greeks. Success meant you could recite. Excellence meant you could dazzle with metaphor. Whether you could spot an infection, well, that was someone else's job. In rare cases, a university-trained physician might be called to court to impress a noble diagnose a king, or write an advisory scroll. But even then, direct care was avoided. Instead, recommendations were passed down the chain, delivered by lesser healers who administered the actual treatments. If something went wrong, the physician could always claim the assistant misunderstood. Plausible deniability wrapped in velvet. Some scholars continue to debate how much this structure helped or harmed patients. Was the system designed to preserve knowledge or simply to protect the elite from accountability? Surviving records offer mixed answers, praising the wisdom of scholars while quietly lamenting the stubborn illnesses that never quite went away. And so, as you leave the lecture hall, robes swirling behind you, you realize something curious in medieval medicine. To look the part was often more important than playing it. You don't meet your doctor today. Instead, a boy collects your urine in a little clay pot and carries it off like treasure. Somewhere far away, a man in a fur hat sniffs it thoughtfully, squints at the color, and writes down a verdict. Welcome to the world of medieval uroscopy. This isn't some odd side ritual, it's the main event. To understand your health, physicians believed they had to read your urine like a map. It was called casting the water, and it held more weight than your symptoms. The practice went back to antiquity, but in the Middle Ages it became a full-blown performance. Imagine shelves lined with colored flasks arranged in a spectrum, from ghostly pale to ominously red. Each hue had meaning. Straw-colored might mean you were digesting well. Deep brown liver issues, perhaps. Cloudy with flecks, possible humoral imbalance. And if it smelled sweet, well, the diagnosis could range from diabetes to demonic possession. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were based more on observation or on borrowed tradition. And yes, they really did smell it. A good physician trained his nose to detect nuances, fruity, musty, metallic. He compared notes on texture, even taste in some extreme and mercifully rare cases. The tools of the trade included urine charts painted with cheerful colors, parchment manuals listing every possible shade, and small portable flasks made of glass or horn perfect for travel or court visits. What's striking is that this entire ritual often took place without seeing the patient. Some physicians never left their studies diagnosing purely by the bottle. They'd receive a note describing the person's symptoms, sometimes with astrological charts attached. From this distance, they would recommend leeches' herbal stews, or even a pilgrimage depending on what the urine said. Some scholars argue this was a practical solution in an era with limited mobility and widespread disease. Others see it as medical theater designed to reassure, impress, or at least mystify the patient into compliance. There is no scholarly consensus on whether uroscopy ever truly helped, but it lingered far longer than most practices, surviving well into the Renaissance and even creeping into early modern texts. Oddly enough, the shape of the flask itself became a symbol of the medical profession. You'll find it carved into tombstones, embroidered on gowns, even included in university seals. For a time, to hold a urine flask was to hold knowledge, however murky that knowledge might be. One particularly quirky detail: some physicians insisted on examining urine at specific times of day. Early morning samples were best, they claimed, because the night's confusion has settled. Others preferred midday arguing. It offered a clearer snapshot of the humors. The idea that your internal chaos could be neatly bottled and judged like fine wine still puzzles modern minds. And so, while you lie in bed coughing or sweating, or both, your fate is being pondered over by someone who has never heard your voice, only seen your color in glass. A wooden shelf creaks under the weight of dried herbs, copper scales, and small clay bowls. Yet none of these items matter more than the invisible theory guiding every decision: the four humors. In medieval medicine, your body wasn't a machine. It was a delicate stew of fluids, and every symptom pointed to an imbalance. The theory was ancient, stretching back to Hippocrates and Galen, but it reached full cultural saturation in the Middle Ages. According to this worldview, you were made of four primary substances: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each humor was linked to an element, a season, even a personality. Too much blood: you'd be cheerful but prone to nosebleeds. Too much black bile, melancholic and possibly cursed. Treatments weren't designed to fight disease, but to restore balance. If you burned with fever, the physician assumed you had excess yellow bile and prescribed something: cooling cucumber sleep, or perhaps a leech. So how did they correct these imbalances? Welcome to the grim buffet of medieval therapy. Bleeding was most popular, cutting a vein or applying leeches to drain blood and hopefully heat. Purging followed close behind. Herbal laxatives and forced vomiting helped expel toxins even if they left you weaker. And then there were the dietary regimes: hot foods for cold bodies, dry foods for moist personalities. Garlic might treat a sluggish liver. Pears soothed a fiery temperament. Patients sometimes spent weeks on such diets, their meals shaped entirely by medieval metaphysics. Some scholars argue these treatments reflected an early form of psychosomatic care, a belief that aligning mind, body, and nature could restore health. Others suggest it was guesswork cloaked in theory. There's no consensus on how literally people took humoral medicine. For the elites, it may have been intellectual fashion. For the poor, simply the only option. One curious legacy: even barber surgeons, apothecaries, and herbalists respected the humors. A village healer might not know Latin, but she'd still recommend mint tea for excess phlegm. Midwives balanced the mother's wetness after birth. It was one of the few medical languages everyone shared. In some cases, patients even participated. They tracked their own humoral shifts, using personal journals or signs from dreams and seasons. I felt colder after the eclipse, one monk wrote, blaming his melancholy on celestial imbalance. The body, the stars, and the soul were all stitched together by invisible threads. Remove one, and everything unraveled. And yes, bleeding happened often. Veins in the arms, ankles, or neck were opened with small knives. The blood caught in ceramic bowls marked with lines. Physicians watched the color: closely bright red. Was healthy dark, and thick was corrupted. Many believe this practice purified the spirit as well as the body. Historians still debate whether the psychological relief of bloodletting helped more than the act itself. So, As your physician prescribes a bland stew, a brisk walk at dawn, and perhaps a small incision above your elbow. Remember, it's all in service of the humors. Just don't ask which one you're losing. The stars were not just for poets and sailors. In medieval medicine, they were part of the prescription. Long before horoscopes became a newspaper novelty, your doctor might consult Saturn to decide when to apply a leech. Welcome to astrological medicine, where your spleen's condition might hinge on the moon's mood. You lie in bed while the physician hovers over a parchment chart, ink still fresh. Your birth date and the hour of your first symptom have been plotted against constellations. Mars is rising, which could explain the fever. Jupiter's in retrograde, bad news for digestion. Every organ belonged to a planet, the liver to Jupiter, the brain to the moon, the heart to the sun. Diagnosis began by locating your pain on the body and then consulting the heavens for guidance. Treatments were scheduled by lunar phase. No matter how serious the ailment, timing was everything. This wasn't fringe belief, it was mainstream. Major medical texts like the Taquinum Sanitatis included charts aligning planetary movements with appropriate remedies. Some physicians refused to bleed a patient unless the moon was waning. Others scheduled surgeries only when Mars was benevolent, and certain herbs like fennel or rosemary were harvested under specific stars to retain their healing potency. Historians continue to debate whether astrology was a genuine tool or simply a way to lend cosmic gravitas to uncertain decisions. Astrological medicine wasn't just for elites. Farmers timed plantings by star signs, midwives tracked moon cycles to anticipate births, and barbers used simple zodiac wheels to guide their bloodletting. Even skeptics hedged their bets just in case. Better to wait for a lucky day than risk cosmic backlash. A quirky example. One 14th century guide recommended avoiding surgery when the moon was in Cancer, lest the incision refused to heal. Another warned against purging. When Saturn ruled the sky, it might bring on melancholy. Patients often receive tiny star charts with their prescriptions, as if the heavens themselves had endorsed the treatment. Some physicians, particularly in Islamic Spain and Persia, developed highly sophisticated astromedical systems. They combined astronomy with humoral theory, calculating planetary temperaments that affected bodily fluids. Saturn, cold and dry, could worsen black bile disorders. Venus, warm and moist, soothed them. These charts required training and mathematical skill. A doctor who mastered them could impress both patients and peers. But not everyone agreed. Church authorities grew uneasy. Some labeled astrology a distraction from divine healing. Others feared it edged too close to magic. Debates flared in universities and pulpits. Yet the practice persisted quietly, steadily woven into prescriptions and whispered consultations. It lingered in the margins of medicine long after new scientific methods emerged. So, here you are, sweating under a woolen blanket while your physician waits for Venus to clear the western sky before prescribing mint tea and a bath. Does it work? Hard to say. But in this world, to ignore the stars would seem far riskier than the illness itself. The moment you cough, the physician nods grimly and reaches for his blade. There's no exam, no stethoscope, not even a polite question. You're about to be bled because in the medieval medical playbook, relief began with release, and the most trusted cure-all bloodletting. The tools are simple but unsettling. A brass bowl notched to measure how much blood to drain. A phlegm small, sharp, shaped like a bird's beak. And, if you're lucky, a few leeches swimming lazily in a clay jar. The idea is clear. Remove the excess and balance the humors. Whether you have a fever, a headache, or an ominous twitch in your eye, the first step is often the same: make a cut. This wasn't a fringe ritual. Bloodletting was a cornerstone of medieval medicine, endorsed by physicians and barber surgeons alike. In towns across Europe, red and white poles outside barber shops signaled that blood was part of the business. The red for blood, the white for the bandages. These poles still exist today, relics of a time when your haircut came with minor surgery. Some historians believe this dual role blurred lines dangerously. Others suggest it filled a crucial gap in public health. And barbers weren't shy about their tools. They carried gleaming shears, curved razors, and bone saws tucked in leather rolls. A good barber surgeon could shave your beard lance a boil and set a broken arm all before lunch. Training was informal at best. Some learn it on the job, others from older barbers or traveling workshops. Degrees unnecessary. What mattered was reputation and maybe a steady hand. The procedures varied. For general malaise, a vein in the arm was opened. For headaches, behind the ears. For lung issues, the ankle. It sounds arbitrary, but each site was linked loosely to the ailment. Leeches were favored for delicate areas, the temples, the neck, even inside the mouth. Yes, you read that correctly. Some patients sat calmly while leeches wriggled between their gums. Records suggest the amount of blood drawn could be substantial. One popular guide recommended until the patient swoons but not collapses. The theory fainting showed success. A lighter body was a balanced body. Today we might call that alarming. Back then it was Tuesday. One particularly odd detail, the color and flow of blood, were scrutinized like wine. Thin, bright, fast, healthy. Thick, dark, sluggish, corrupted. If the blood came out in spurts, some saw that as evidence of inner conflict, perhaps between the humors, perhaps the soul. Did it help? Historians are divided. Some argue bloodletting offered psychological relief, a way for patients to feel cared for, purged, even absolved. Others see it as misguided, at best harmful, at worst. Surviving patient records show mixed outcomes. Some recovered, some declined, some likely suffered from the very treatment meant to cure them. But in the medieval world, certainty was rare, so the cut was made, the bowl filled, and the patient, pale and quiet, was sent home to rest, hopefully with fewer demons than before. No velvet robes, no university seal, just a leather satchel, a wooden cross, and a quiet knock on the cottage door. Outside, the city's medieval medicine looked very different. Here, healing came not from textbooks, but from nettles, moldy bread, and whispered words passed down through generations. You're a peasant with a fever lying on a straw mat as the village healer leans over you. Maybe she's a wise woman, her apron pockets full of dried chamomile and foxglove. Or maybe he's a local priest, learned enough to read the Psalms and recite a healing charm. Either way, you're not getting bled today. You're getting a poultice of mashed onion, a prayer, and a firm warning to avoid cold winds and spoiled cheese. Rural medicine was deeply practical. Without access to trained physicians who often avoided the countryside entirely, villagers relied on what they had, herbs from the hedgerows, advice from elders, and rituals that blurred the line between science and faith. Some treatments were remarkably effective. Willow bark for pain, moldy bread. For infections, fennel to settle the stomach. Modern researchers have found surprising pharmacological value in many of these folk remedies, though historians still debate whether the results were due to the ingredients or belief. A curious example, nettle whippings. For joint pain or paralysis, healers would swat the afflicted area with fresh nettles, provoking stings and inflammation. The theory was that pain drove out pain. Bizarre, perhaps. But the capsaicin-like effect of nettles is now recognized for stimulating circulation. The line between quackery and insight was finer than we'd expect. Faith was woven into every treatment. A fever might be seen as divine punishment, a test from God or a sign of spiritual imbalance. Prayers were said over herbal teas. Relics were placed beneath pillows. Saints were invoked for everything from toothaches to childbirth. Saint Apollonia, for instance, was the go-to for dental issues. A small statue of her tucked into your bed frame might bring relief faster than any salve. Some healers were feared as much as trusted. The local cunning folk men and women who claimed special knowledge could draw crowds with their cures, but also accusations of witchcraft. During times of disease or famine, the same people who were praised one week could be blamed the next. Records show cases where village healers were revered as saints by some and denounced as heretics by others. Scholars still puzzle over these contradictions, seeing in them a deeper anxiety about who held power over life and death. Yet many rural remedies endured. Recipes were passed down through families, copied into household books shared across market stalls. Unlike formal physicians, these healers relied on results not Latin. If your cough improved after a week of elderflower steam, you told your neighbors. If it didn't, you tried something else. So while the cities leaned on theory here in the thatched cottages of Europe, healing was a lived, messy, and often miraculous thing, rooted in mud moss and memory. You expect white walls and nurses in crisp uniforms. Instead, you're greeted by candle smoke, chanted prayers, and the smell of old bread. This is a hospital medieval style, and it looks more like a chapel than a clinic. In the Middle Ages, hospitals weren't primarily places for curing. They were spaces for care, rest, and spiritual reflection. The word hospital came from the Latin hospes, meaning guest. And that's exactly how you were treated, not as a patient, but as a pilgrim passing through suffering. The goal wasn't necessarily to heal your body, it was to prepare your soul. You're lying on a narrow bed inside a stone hall. Stained glass windows cast soft colors across the floor. Nearby, a nun adjusts your blanket and murmurs a psalm. She's not a doctor, but she knows how to mix a poultice and say a blessing in the same breath. Meals are small, porridge, maybe bread and ale, and always come with a prayer. Illness, after all, is part of God's plan. These hospitals were run by religious orders: Benedictines, Augustinians, Cistercians. Monks and nuns managed the daily rhythm of care, washing feet, tending wounds, offering last rites. Their focus was as much on charity as on cure. Healing, when it happened, was seen as divine mercy. When it didn't, the patient's soul was guided toward peace. Architecturally, these places were designed with prayer in mind. Long, narrow dormitories pointed toward altars. Beds were arranged so that no one's head blocked another's view of the cross. In some cases, patients were wheeled into mass, their stretchers lining the nave. Cleanliness was emphasized not because of germ theory, but to preserve dignity. Many hospitals included large washing rooms and rules about personal hygiene, which some scholars argue contributed more to recovery than the treatments themselves. Treatments varied. Mild herbal teas, compresses, careful feeding. Serious interventions like surgery were rarely done here. If you needed a trepanation or limb setting, you'd be sent elsewhere, likely to a barber, surgeon, or home with instructions. The monastery's role was to keep you comfortable, not to fix what was broken. Some historians view this as a failure of medieval medicine. Others argue it reflects a different set of priorities, ones we've forgotten. Curiously, hospitals weren't just for the poor. Wealthy donors often paid for beds to be reserved in case of future need. Some even stayed during periods of anxiety, treating the hospital like a retreat. And in a few cities, hospitals doubled as shelters for orphans, the elderly, and travelers. They were social safety nets wrapped in ritual. There's a moment near dusk when all the candles are lit and the singing begins. Your fever hasn't broken, but something in you relaxes. It's not the cure you hoped for, but it's comfort. And in this world, where medicine and faith walk hand in hand, that might be more than enough. He hums while sharpening his blade, cheerful as a butcher on market day. This isn't your learned physician. It's the barber-surgeon part. Stylist, sawbones fully fearless. When you hear the knock on your door, and see his leather apron, it's already too late to pretend you're not sick. He carries a bag that clinks with metal curved knives, pliers, bone hooks, and something that looks suspiciously like a meat cleaver. His hands are strong, his laugh louder than you'd expect from someone about to drain a boil. His job covers everything from pulling teeth to setting fractures, from draining abscesses to slicing off warts. Surgery in this era is less precision, more practicality. You sit in a wooden chair as he examines your lump. It's swollen red and clearly infected. He nods once decisively and unrolls a cloth. A cup of ale is placed in your hand. Not for sterilization, just for courage. Moments later, he lances the swelling with a swift cut. The pressure releases you, gasp, and he grins. "That'll feel better by winter," he says, as if discussing weather, not wounds. Barber surgeons filled the gap between theoretical medicine and hands-on necessity. Trained in workshops, not universities, they were often dismissed by elite physicians. Yet for most townspeople, they were the real lifesavers. Accessible, affordable, and unafraid to act. Some cities even licensed them, creating guilds with specific ranks. Apprentices swept floors and learned to shave. Journeymen cut hair and treated injuries. Masters performed full surgeries. Hernias, amputations, even bladder stone removals. Historians still debate the line between healer and hazard. Records show high mortality rates for complex procedures, but also note surprising recoveries. Barber surgeons weren't gentle, but they were efficient. And in a world without anesthesia, efficiency was mercy. One particularly unsettling service tooth pulling in the marketplace. A crowd would gather as the barber yanked molars from screaming mouths, sometimes offering a second extraction half price. Theatrics were part of the appeal. Blood and bravado reassured onlookers that action at least was being taken. Tools were often reused with minimal cleaning. A quick rinse in ale, maybe a wipe on the apron. Infection was common, but poorly understood. Many patients survived anyway, thanks more to luck and strong constitutions than to hygiene. Some barber surgeons recognized patterns, keeping certain herbs handy, avoiding cuts on certain days. But overall, it was a rough business. And yet, trust in them endured. People returned to their favorite barber surgeon year after year, even requesting them by name in their wills. "Let Master William attend me as he did Father," before one testament reads. There's a strange comfort in continuity, even when that continuity involves hot irons and bone saws. So, when your swelling subsides and the bandage begins to stiffen with blood, you feel oddly grateful, not cured, not whole, but cared for. The barber pats your shoulder packs up his tools and heads off whistling to his next patient. Saints and scholars may write the theory, but in this world, it's the man with the saw who gets things done. Dust clings to the edges of the leather binding. Gold leaf glints faintly beneath a film of soot. But no one's opening this book, not today, not ever really. Welcome to the medieval medical library, where heavy tomes were prized more for their presence than their pages. You step into a physician's study and see shelves lined with ancient volumes. The air smells of ink wax and ambition. Titles like Canon of Avicenna and De Natura Rerum impress the visitor, even if the owner hasn't cracked them open in years. One text sits on a pedestal, unread but lovingly dusted, as if wisdom might seep out through osmosis. These weren't light reading. Most were written in Latin or Arabic, copied by hand, over decades often beautifully illuminated. They contained vast compendiums of medical theory, everything from pulse diagnosis to the healing power of gemstones. But in practice, most physicians relied on memory, tradition, and experience. Scholars continue to debate how often these texts were truly consulted. Were they references, decorations? Professional props some physicians, to be fair, did study diligently, but the pressure to own certain books often outweighed the pressure to understand them. Owning a well-known manuscript signaled education and wealth, and alignment with the great thinkers of the past. Galen said this. Hippocrates wrote that. Quoting the ancients was more important than questioning them. In some cases, a single book might cost as much as a small house. Students copied lectures by line by line over candlelight. An error in transcription could mean a dangerous misunderstanding, prescribing hemlock instead of parsley, for instance. Still, the books multiplied. Monasteries kept scriptoria busy, while merchants traded prized volumes across Europe and the Islamic world. A particularly curious example, the Trotula, a medieval gynecological manual. Compiled in Salerno, it offered detailed and occasionally awkward advice on women's health. It was copied widely, and sometimes attributed wrongly to a female physician named Troda. Historians still argue whether she was real symbolic or simply misremembered. The book itself, however, outlived its authors, slipping quietly into university curricula. Not all books aimed at healing. Some were more mystical treatises on astrology, dream interpretation, or divine intervention. One manuscript describes a lunar balm that works best when applied during a waning crescent, while another recommends goat dung mixed with wine as a cure for gout. Physicians might keep these texts nearby, not necessarily to use them, but to show their intellectual range. Better to appear prepared for anything, even if the remedy involved powdered emeralds. There's something oddly familiar here. The medieval doctor hunched over a pile of books quoting rather than questioning. The performance of knowing. The illusion of mastery. Some scholars draw comparisons to modern medicine's reliance on jargon and credentials. Others push back, arguing the past was messier, more intuitive. So, as you sit in that candlelit chamber, watching the physician gesture toward a closed volume with practiced authority, you begin to understand. The book may not heal you, but its presence, like the doctor's robe or the astrological chart, is part of the ritual. The cupboard creaks open to reveal a curious collection, goat fat in a jar, powdered pearl in a pouch, and something that looks suspiciously like dried lizard. This is no apothecary from a fairy tale. It's the real deal, medieval style, and it smells exactly like you'd expect, pungent, earthy, with a hint of panic. Here, medicine meets mystery. Ingredients come from field forest and folklore. Some make perfect sense, lavender for sleep, honey for wounds. Others raise eyebrows, crushed emeralds for epilepsy, burnt hedgehog skin for fever. The logic, if you can call it that, was a patchwork of Greek theory, local superstition, and sheer experimentation. Yet this chaotic mix formed the backbone of most medieval treatments. You sit at the edge of a rough-hewn bench while the apothecary, cloaked in soot-stained linen, prepares your remedy. It includes leeches for circulation, plasters made with clay vinegar, and sometimes cow dung to draw out heat, and goat fat not as a joke, but as a base for ointments. When melted and mixed with herbs, it spreads well and soothes inflamed skin. Useful, and very aromatic. Ingredients varied wildly depending on geography and supply. In southern Europe, you might find saffron, dates, and myrrh. In the north, mugwort, garlic, and goose grease. Imported items like ambergris or cinnamon added prestige and price, even if their medicinal effects were debatable. Some recipes called for human parts, fingernail scrapings, breast milk, or even mummified flesh ground into powder. Scholars continue to debate how widespread these practices were and whether they were ever truly effective. A particularly odd detail. Animal parts weren't just for the shelf, they were sometimes used symbolically. A fox's tooth might be worn to cure cowardice. Owl eggs baked into bread were said to cure drunkenness. Powdered staghorn was thought to increase courage. Some remedies required reciting a charm while applying the paste-blending medicine and magic into a single act. The apothecary's book is a chaotic treasure-smeared ink notes in the margins, occasional doodles of saints or skulls. Each recipe is a legacy passed from mentor to apprentice, more oral than academic. Measurements are vague, a handful enough to cover a walnut boil until it hisses twice. Consistency optional. Despite this, some concoctions genuinely worked. Willow bark eased pain. Moldy bread contained penicillin precursors. Garlic and wine cleaned wounds better than you'd think. But separating what helped from what horrified is a challenge even for modern researchers. And that's part of the mystery. Some cures weren't pharmacological at all. They were psychological. The ritual of preparation, the trust in tradition, the comfort of a warm compress held by caring hands. You sip your herbal mixture, thick with thyme, nettle, and a pinch of ash. It tastes like dirt and bitterness, but something in you relaxes. Maybe it's the warmth, maybe it's the belief, or maybe it's just the goat fat doing its strange, sleepy job. You cough again wetter this time. The healer nods solemnly, though his expression hasn't changed since you arrived. Another symptom, another mystery. Medieval diagnosis wasn't about tests or confirmation. It was a performance of intuition, tradition, and guesswork, where the body spoke in riddles and the doctor translated as best he could. In this world, there were no thermometers, no microscopes, no lab reports. Instead, healers relied on visible signs, redness, swelling, changes in urine, strange dreams. A wet cough might signal too much phlegm. Pale skin, perhaps, cold humors were winning. Sore joints during winter, clearly the work of damp air, or perhaps divine displeasure. Every symptom had multiple explanations, some contradictory, some poetic. A curious case from 13th century France describes a patient with wandering aches. The diagnosis his humors had become unmoored, drifting through the body like lost pilgrims. The treatment involved warm broth music and leeches placed at his temples. Some historians suggest this was more about comfort than cure. Others believe the diagnosis may have cloaked deeper knowledge, an intuitive grasp of chronic illness cloaked in metaphor. A major challenge was overlap. Multiple diseases produced similar symptoms. Whether you had tuberculosis or a seasonal flu, the signs looked the same: fatigue, fever, cough. One ailment might be called catarrh of the lungs, another inflammation of the chest vapors. Often the diagnosis was simply the name of the symptom itself. You have a dryness, the physician might say, nodding gravely. Not wrong, but not helpful either. And then there was the issue of treatment. Because the theory of humors dominated most illnesses, no matter their cause, were treated similarly. Imbalance was the enemy, so rebalancing became the goal. That might mean bleeding, purging a change in diet, or exposure to fresh air. It also meant that two patients with entirely different conditions might receive the same treatment. Whether that helped or hurt remains a question scholars still debate. One particularly odd habit diagnosing from dreams. Certain symbols, snakes, whales, flying birds, were thought to signal internal issues. If you dreamt of falling, it might suggest a cold stomach. If you saw fire, it pointed to excess bile. The idea was that the unconscious revealed what the body couldn't say aloud. Priests sometimes participated in this process, interpreting dreams as divine warnings. In some cases, the diagnosis itself became a kind of medicine. The word soothed gave shape to fear, allowed families to prepare. A name, even a vague one, offered power. "You have a dampness in your lungs," the healer would say, and suddenly the chaos felt manageable. Not curable, perhaps, but at least named. So here you are, tucked beneath a wool blanket, listening to your healer mutter about phlegm and planetary influence. You don't quite understand, but his tone is confident, his eyes kind. And somehow, that matters more than the accuracy of his guess. You'd think a clean robe and a confident voice couldn't fix a broken arm, but in medieval medicine, appearance was half the battle. The doctor who looked wise sounded learned and carried exotic tools, earned trust before ever laying a hand on a patient. Healing came second. Branding came first. Imagine a physician arriving at your door, not with urgency but with ceremony. He wears a fur-trimmed robe dyed in costly saffron, a heavy ring glinting on one finger. From a leather case he pulls instruments that shine scales flasks, and a thin silver rod meant to stir powders. His words are slow and deliberate, peppered with Latin. You have no idea what he's saying, but it sounds intelligent, comforting even. This was the business of looking smart. Physicians knew their power didn't just come from knowledge, it came from perception. Robes of certain colors indicated status: red for doctoral authority, black for seasoned mastery. Accessories mattered too: jeweled amulets, brass astrolabes, gilded syringes. One physician even wore a pendant said to absorb disease through proximity. The object's efficacy remains dubious, its symbolic value indisputable. Public performance played a key role. Physicians visited courts, monasteries, even marketplaces, not to treat, but to be seen. Offering a consultation to a noble lady or giving a public reading from Galen's texts elevated their social capital. Some scholars argue that medieval medicine functioned as much like a theatrical profession as a healing one. Results were desirable, but a persuasive presence was essential. Clients, particularly among the wealthy, expected this performance. They didn't just want help, they wanted reassurance. The doctor's calm tone, smooth gestures, and orderly bag of tools created a sense of control. In a world full of chaos, plague, famine, and mysterious ailments, control was a rare and precious illusion. A curious anecdote: one 15th century physician was famed not for his cures, but for the mirror he always carried. He claimed it helped reflect a patient's inner balance. In truth, he likely used it to examine their complexion. But his reputation soared, part mystic, part magician. Some people sought his presence even when healthy. Just hear his poetic descriptions of their humors. Branding extended to written materials, too. Some physicians paid scribes to create elaborate copies of common texts, complete with illuminated margins and faux author endorsements. These were more for display than study. A patient might see the book on the physician's desk and assume a library of wisdom stood behind him. Scholars continue to debate how much of this was fraud versus cultural norm. Perhaps it was both. And then there were the exotic import spices, incense, odd minerals displayed in apothecary jars labeled in Arabic or Greek. Never mind if they worked. What mattered was that they came from far away, carried mystery, and smelled expensive. Even today, prestige often masquerades as competence. So, as your doctor arranges his flasks just so, quoting Aristotle while offering a licorice root tonic, you begin to feel a little better. Not because the tonic works, but because someone at least seems to know what they're doing. A bell tolls in the distance. The streets are too quiet. Your neighbors are gone. The baker's shutters are closed, and the city physician, if he ever existed, is nowhere to be found. Plague has arrived, and in its wake, silence. During outbreaks, everything changed. Physicians who normally thrived on routine, the urine inspections, the humoral diagrams, the carefully rehearsed Latin phrases, suddenly faced chaos. Theories buckled under the weight of bodies. And so many doctors did what anyone might do in their position: they ran. There's no shortage of records noting their absence. Chronicles describe learned men fleeing cities in haste, abandoning patients, friends, even families. Some historians excuse this as survival instinct. Others see betrayal. Either way, their flight left a void. In their place rose midwives, herbalists, monks, and the truly desperate. Healing became improvised, urgent, and often fatal. Yet not every physician fled. Some stayed writing accounts by candlelight. One described watching black buboes bloom like ripe figs under the skin. Another tried to lance them, documenting the putrid results with grim precision. Some wore beak-like masks filled with herbs to filter the miasma. The look was terrifying bird-headed specters drifting through foggy alleys, but the intention was sincere. They were trying. They just didn't know how. Wealthy citizens, of course, had options. They packed carts and fled to countryside estates. Entire courts relocated at the first sign of illness. Physicians traveled with them, offering preventative regimens. Eat lightly, bathe, infrequently avoid bad air. Incense burned night and day. Letters from these retreats sometimes describe symptoms secondhand as if distance itself was a cure. Meanwhile, the poor remained behind, trapped, coughing, waiting. Churches filled. Processions marched through streets. Some carried statues, others whips. Prayer and penance mingled with panic. Illness, after all, was still seen by many as divine punishment. Healers blessed bread, painted crosses on doors, and urged confession. The line between doctor and priest blurred completely. Some scholars argue this was the moment when medieval medicine's limitations became impossible to ignore. A peculiar detail in Florence physicians were ordered to record the names and symptoms of every plague victim. These lists survive today, columns of fading ink chronicling not just disease, but abandonment. The entries grow shorter, shakier until they stop altogether. One page ends with the phrase, "No one came." And yet, amidst the horror, new methods emerged. Quarantine borrowed from Eastern practices began appearing in port cities. Some towns established pest houses, primitive isolation centers, where the sick were sent to die or sometimes recover. Trial and error replaced theory. Leeches gave way to linen soaked in vinegar. Prayers continued, but so did observation. Was it enough? Rarely. But it marked a shift from inherited wisdom to lived experience. Some historians argue the plague planted seeds of medical reform, shaking the old systems just enough to let new ideas through. So, as the bell tolls again and you sit by a shuttered window, the physician's absence speaks volumes. Sometimes healing isn't about action. It's about who shows up and who doesn't. You're feeling better, or maybe just less worse. Either way, the physician seems pleased, though it's hard to say what that means in a world where recovery is relative. The question lingers like the scent of sage in the room. Did they actually help? Or did they just appear to? Medieval healing was as much about ritual as remedy. Robes, Latin charts, and prayers, all carefully arranged to create the illusion of certainty. And maybe sometimes that illusion did help. Belief, after all, is a powerful medicine. You look back on everything, the leeches, the pungent ointments, the morning urine ceremonies. None of it feels especially scientific, not by modern standards. But it wasn't aimless either. Each act carried symbolic weight, tapping into a worldview that saw body and soul as entangled threads. Treating the one meant touching the other. Whether or not the result was health, the process offered structure in the face of suffering, and for many, that was enough. Some patients swore by their healers. Even when treatments failed, they returned trusting in reputation, in the comfort of the known. One medieval diary tells of a man who walked 30 miles each month to visit a physician who could not stop his coughing, but made the room smell sweet and spoke kindly. Perhaps that was cure enough. Others had harsher fates. Records are filled with accounts of botched treatments, misdiagnoses, and preventable deaths. Women misdiagnosed with hysteria. Soldiers treated for heat when their wounds festered with rot. Some scholars argued the system protected physicians more than patients, placing theory and prestige above trial and outcome. Yet still the sick came. And that raises the final curious paradox. Did healing mean being cured, or did it mean being seen, named, and folded into a system that gave your pain meaning? In medieval Europe, the act of diagnosis, however vague, transformed your suffering into a story. a tale with causes, influences, and symbolic echoes. It wasn't "you're sick," it was "your bile is hot because Mars is rising and your dreams are sharp." Suddenly your body made sense, and in a time of uncertainty, that sense could soothe more than any salve. Some historians believe that's the true legacy of medieval medicine, not the herbs or bloodletting, but the human need to explain illness in a way that fits the world around us. We still do it, just with different vocabulary: molecules instead of humors, viruses instead of vapors. The longing is the same. So, as your physician packs up his tools, bows low, and retreats down the candlelit hall, you lie back on your cot. The fever has passed, or maybe not, but you were tended to. Your cough was measured, your urine examined, your fate considered. And something in that process, however strange, feels like healing. And just when the shadows seem to settle, another remedy rises from the depth of folklore, stranger, slimier, and somehow no less sincere. You barely have time to process one ritual before another squelches into view. You lie still in the corner of a stone infirmary. The air smells of wax-wet stone and something earthy. A friar kneels beside you, muttering in Latin, dipping his fingers into a murky salve. Earthworms harvested after rain, mashed with vinegar and barley flour. The texture is more porridge than potion. He spreads it onto your wound with the solemnity of a priest delivering a sacrament. To a modern observer, it seems absurd, but in medieval Europe, the natural world was full of clues. Earthworms regenerate when cut. Surely that meant they could help humans heal. The logic wasn't biochemical, it was symbolic. Healing was a kind of sympathy between body and nature. And in a world without antibiotics or germ theory, anything that offered hope, no matter how slimy, earned a place on the shelf. A 14th century herbal manuscript from Italy includes multiple worm-based recipes, some of them astonishingly elaborate. One involved leaving the worms in wine for 9 days, then boiling the mixture with honey and lavender. Another instructed practitioners to dry the worms in the sun before grinding them into powder, which could be mixed with rose oil and applied to sword gashes. Chroniclers described miraculous results, though the line between miracle and survival bias is wiggly. Not everyone agreed. Some monastic scholars dismissed the practice as superstition, bordering on witchcraft. The debate lingered. Were these wriggling creatures healers, or merely vermin given honorary status in the absence of real cures? Historians still argue whether this was early empirical medicine or a desperate dance of symbols and mud. Either way, earthworms had their moment in the torchlight. Time to get slimier. If worms made for good medicine, why stop there? Enter the reptilian section of your medieval pharmacy. Toads, lizards, and other creatures that slithered or leapt their way into ointments. You're not hallucinating. These animals were not only ingredients, but honored guests in the dusty cabinets of apothecaries. You're sitting on a 3-legged stool, while a woman in a linen coif gently unwraps a bundle from her apron. Inside, a shriveled toad. It smells faintly of moss and smoke. She plucks off one foot, grinds it with thyme, and something that might be soot, and presses the black paste against the lump on your neck. She assures you this will help with the swelling. You're not sure what's worse, the lump or the cure. Toad tinctures were widely believed to draw out bad humors. For skin conditions like scrofula ulcers and boils, their application ranged from mild to well disturbing. Some treatments involved pressing a live toad to the skin until it stopped moving. Others relied on the dried and powdered animal mixed with herbs or wine. It sounds barbaric now, but it wasn't just folklore. Many of these treatments made it into formal medical texts, some written in Latin, others in the vernacular for local healers. Lizards weren't spared either. Especially in southern Europe, dried lizard, often identified as gecko or skink, was believed to treat leprosy. The logic: lizards shed their skin. Leprosy, thought to be a disease of corrupted flesh, might be reversed by sympathetic magic. If the lizard renews, perhaps, so could you. Some recipes called for boiling the animal whole and straining the broth into a salve. Others preserved it in vinegar and rosewater, creating a greenish tonic believed to cool the blood. Even in the late Middle Ages, physicians were divided. Scholars at Salerno and Montpellier debated the value of these animal cures. Some dismissed them as peasant nonsense. Others insisted that just because a remedy was odd didn't mean it lacked efficacy. The tension between rational medicine and ritual was constant, an uneasy truce negotiated in candlelit cells and muddy fields. One curious footnote: toads were often associated with poison in folklore, and yet they were used to treat poison swelling and even convulsions. A 12th century French manual claimed that placing a toad under the armpit during a fever could draw out the sickness. Another said to roast the toad and wear its ash in a linen pouch around the neck. Neither sounds pleasant. Both sound very medieval. Modern researchers tend to roll their eyes, though some admit that the sheer consistency of these records hints at more than pure fantasy. There is no scholarly consensus on whether symbolism alone explains their popularity, or whether repeated observation led some to believe they actually worked. In either case, if you ever find yourself in medieval France with a swollen cheek and a helpful herpetologist nearby, maybe don't ask too many questions. Just hold still and hope for the best. You're still recovering from the toad, but now someone's waving a crusty loaf of bread near your face. It's moldy, intentionally. A corner is sliced off, revealing soft green fuzz nestled in the cracks. This isn't a snack, it's a salve. Welcome to the accidental genius of medieval bruising treatment. In a world without antiseptic or refrigeration, bread turned moldy fast and clever, or perhaps desperate healers took note. In rural cottages and monastery infirmaries, moldy bread was rubbed onto cuts, bruises, and inflamed skin. It wasn't just a one-off accident. Some communities swore by the practice. There are records from England, Germany, and even parts of the Ottoman Empire describing this strange remedy as far back as the 9th century. You watch a child scrape a hunk of green bread across his scraped knee, while a grandmother nods approvingly. It's a rite of passage as much tradition as treatment. The smell is tangy, almost sweet, and for a brief moment, oddly comforting. Today we know that penicillium, the mold that eventually led to penicillin, has genuine antibiotic properties. Of course, medieval people didn't have petri dishes or microscopes, but what they did have was keen observation. Over time, they noticed that wounds treated with moldy bread sometimes healed better, or at least got worse less often. That was enough. One manuscript from 13th century Wales recommends a poultice of rye bread honey and the white mold of corners applied to bruises that pulse or shine. Another from a Florentine apothecary mentions scraping the green from stale loaves, mixing it with crushed garlic, and binding it with linen. Whether it worked or not, people remembered the experience and remembered the relief. Elite doctors were less impressed. To them, bread mold was a peasant's trick unworthy of academic discussion. Their prescriptions leaned toward exotic spices, rare minerals, and complex balances of humors. But among the lower classes where medical options were few and costs mattered, moldy bread remained popular. It was affordable, familiar, and most importantly, not usually worse than the alternatives. Some researchers now believe that these treatments may have occasionally worked due to accidental presence of penicillin-producing mold, though outcomes were wildly inconsistent. Surviving records offer conflicting accounts. Some wounds healed cleanly, others festered. Was it luck? Was it local mold variation? No one knows for sure, yet the bread itself became part of the healing ritual. Healers might whisper blessings over it, wrap it in cloths embroidered with charms, or pair it with prayers. Even if the mold didn't kill bacteria, the act of being cared for, the wrapping, the warmth, the attention offered real comfort. and sometimes that was the point. If nothing else, moldy bread was a medicine you could find in your own kitchen. In a world where doctors might drain your blood or attach leeches, a fuzzy crust of rye seemed almost gentle. Perhaps that's why it lingered in folk memory long after fancier cures faded from fashion. The lighting dims further. Somewhere a bell tolls, and on the apothecary's shelf tucked behind a jar of crushed rose hips and next to a sack of dried beetles lies a small clay pot marked Pulvis craniae humani, powdered human skull. It's time for a headache remedy that's both deeply unsettling and strangely ceremonial. You sit upright on a narrow bed, rubbing your temples. The monk attending you offers no water or herbs. Instead, he spoons out a pinch of grayish dust from the pot and stirs it into a draught of mead. For your pains, he says solemnly. You drink, not entirely sure which part of the experience is supposed to help. This remedy wasn't hidden or fringe. Crushed skull, often sourced from executed criminals or unclaimed bodies, was considered medicinal in parts of Europe from the Roman era through the 17th century. It was especially prescribed for migraines, vertigo, and phantom head pains. The idea was that the skull, as the seat of thought and sensation, held sympathetic power over ailments of the head. The practice likely has ancient roots. Roman physicians used powdered bone in several treatments. But it was during the medieval and early modern periods that the skull became something of a macabre staple in the pharmacopoeia. Some recipes called for burnt bone, others for fresh powder scraped directly from a corpse. If that sounds gruesome, well, it was. But the patients weren't seeking thrills, they were seeking relief. You might assume these remedies came from back alley sorcerers or superstitious villagers, but no, some of the most enthusiastic users were apothecaries and physicians with academic credentials. A few hoarded human bone like precious spice. There's even record of nobles commissioning skull powder from specific individuals believing that virtue or status enhanced the effect. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these beliefs stemmed more from religious mysticism or Greco-Roman medical tradition. Christian iconography is filled with skulls as symbols of mortality and transformation. Some theologians believe that using the skull of a repentant sinner could channel divine healing. Others simply argued that, like cures like, head matter cures head pain. A popular variation included mixing the powder with rosewater or milk, sometimes administered via wafer. In elite circles, it became something of a wellness trend. Grisly, yes, but no worse than bloodletting or arsenic-laced tonics. And for those in chronic pain, even the ghastliest hope could seem worth a try. Modern medicine, unsurprisingly, finds no active ingredient in bone dust to support its effectiveness. Still, one can't ignore the psychological effect such remedies might have had. Ritual belief and the theater of treatment played major roles in the perceived success of medieval cures. When someone handed you a draught laced with mystery and whispered that it had cured a baron's migraines, well, that might be half the cure right there. And if nothing else, the headache gave you something to think about, other than what or who you were drinking. Let's steep things further this time in fox lung. The cup is steaming, the liquid inside a murky tan, floating with flecks of dried something. You lift it cautiously. It smells like wet fur and herbs. Welcome to fox lung tea, the go-to tonic for medieval asthma, at least if your healer believed in the wisdom of the den. Inhaling deeply, you feel the steam brush your face like forest breath. The logic behind this remedy was oddly elegant. Foxes live in narrow burrows breathing stale air. Yet, they seem to thrive. Therefore, their lungs must hold a secret resilience. So, if you struggled to breathe, why not borrow a little of that vulpine vigor? The recipe varied by region. Some involved drying fox lungs over a fire, grinding them with thyme or sage, then steeping the mix into a drinkable tea. Others preferred slicing fresh lungs, thinly boiling them with honey and nettle, and straining through linen. Apothecaries in northern France even sold it in corked flasks with little fox symbols on the wax seals. Of course, we now know this was a poor substitute for, say, inhalers or antibiotics. But in its time, fox lung tea was as respected as any cough syrup. One 14th century English text notes best brewed before moonrise and taken thrice. Another warns that overuse may cause shuddering and odd dreams, which honestly checks out. Foxes themselves held symbolic power in European folklore, clever, elusive, and adaptable. Drinking part of one wasn't just medicine, it was a ritual of transformation. You weren't just soothing your lungs, you were taking on the cunning breath of the wild. In an age when breath was considered a vital essence, or even a measure of the soul, fox lung offered more than function. It offered identity. Some scholars remain puzzled by how widespread the practice was. Recipes for lung tea appear from Iberia to Bohemia. Was this the result of shared knowledge or convergent folklore? Researchers continue to debate whether the treatment had any physiological value, or if it relied entirely on placebo ritual and the reassuringly bitter taste of something that must be good for you because it tasted so bad. Even critics at the time were conflicted. A Spanish physician in the early 1500s wrote that he'd never seen a fox cough a snide remark, but one that revealed how belief and observation could blur. Meanwhile, monks in alpine abbeys recorded cases of monks who swore by the tonic during long winters, claiming it restored the rhythm of breath when prayers could not. So, you sip slowly. The taste is as odd as the logic behind it, smoky earthy, with an afterbite of wildness. Does it help? Hard to say. But perhaps the moment of quiet, the ritual of boiling, steeping, and waiting, is itself part of the healing. In the hush of a stone kitchen, with herbs drying above and firelight flickering across earthen walls, even fox lungs can feel like hope. From fox's defeat, prepare for a cure as crispy as it is confusing. You're ushered into a stone-walled chamber where the scent of scorched fur hangs heavily in the air. A small bundle is unwrapped before you, a hedgehog dried and burnt to charcoal black fragments. The apothecary smiles, faintly gestures toward your gout-swollen foot, and begins to grind. Welcome to Hedgehog Therapy Medieval Edition. The ritual was simple in theory, elaborate in smell. Hedgehog flesh was dried either by sun fire or slow oven heat, then crushed into fine powder. This powder was stirred into warm water wine or vinegar and used as a foot soak. Some recipes suggested combining it with herbs like marjoram or rue. Others insisted on raw hedgehog, pounded into paste and rubbed directly onto the skin. And yes, both roasted and raw options existed in the same century. Consistency was not the strong suit of medieval pharmacology. You sit back your foot, submerged in a cloudy bowl that smells faintly like barbecue and rosemary. The pain throbs. The hedgehog does nothing, yet the apothecary hums a hymn and nods approvingly. You're doing everything right. Why a hedgehog? That's the spiny mystery. Some believed its tendency to curl up defensively symbolized bodily contraction, helpful in drawing swelling inward or neutralizing inflammation. Others pointed to its diet insects and roots. A creature so earthy must surely possess grounding properties. At least one 13th century medical text describes the hedgehog as a beast of inner fire, suited to damp maladies of the limbs. It's unclear who first decided a hedgehog belonged in a treatment plan, but the recipe surfaces across Central Europe and even parts of Persia. A Polish herbal codex describes burnt urchin powder as most effective for noblemen in pain. Meanwhile, in the Rhineland, folk healers recommended hedgehog soup for walking weakness, possibly an early reference to arthritic conditions. Modern historians struggle to understand whether this cure had any medical rationale at all. Some suggest that burnt animal matter, when applied hot, may have acted as a crude counter-irritant, distracting the nervous system from deeper pain. Others dismiss it entirely as ritualized nonsense. There is no scholarly consensus on its efficacy, symbolic meaning, or origins. Still, people believed, and belief is sticky. Gout, after all, was called the king's disease. It afflicted the wealthy, the well-fed, the powerful. Hedgehog therapy offered them something ancient, primal, and a little exotic. In a way, it brought nobility back to earth, both literally and olfactorily. Imagine a bishop soaking his foot in hedgehog broth while discussing church policy. It happened. There's even a delightful, if dubious, folk rhyme from Saxony: roast the beast that walks with spines, it steals the ache from gouty lines. As the steam curls from your foot bath, you wonder, was this all performance, a placebo in fur? Or did those medieval healers know something we don't? The answer may be buried under centuries of soot thorns and very confused hedgehogs. The room grows warmer damp with the scent of vinegar and mustard. You sit wrapped in thick wool, your feet tucked into linen socks soaked in sharp-smelling liquid. Across the chamber, another patient groans, softly swaddled in mustard poultices that seem to steam against the skin. Welcome to the fever ward, where sweating it out was more than a metaphor. Medieval cures for fever were often as intense as the fevers themselves. Vinegar socks, simple garments drenched in sour wine or apple vinegar, were tied around feet ankles and sometimes wrists under the belief that they would draw down the heat from the head. The vinegar was sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary, meant to calm and cool. The goal wasn't just comfort, it was extraction. Get the fever out no matter the method. Then there were mustard poultices. These pungent compresses were made by grinding mustard seeds into a paste and applying it to the chest or spine. The sensation was fiery. Healers wanted you to sweat profusely. The theory held that heat must be matched with more heat, pushing the internal fire out through the skin. Sometimes patients fainted from the intensity. Sometimes they emerged refreshed, claiming the illness had broken. You lie still, the vinegar-soaked socks cold at first, then warming. The heat of the poultice crawls up your chest. A nurse fans you gently. Your entire body pulses with a strange, sweaty urgency. And then nothing. Silence. Stillness. Only the faint drip of vinegar from the edge of your heel. Records from monastic infirmaries describe entire nights devoted to this method. Patients lay bundled like root vegetables in a cellar, sweating beneath layers of wool. In some accounts, fever broke by dawn. In others, well, they tried. Some healers added extra flair, chanting psalms during application, timing the treatment with moon phases or rubbing the socks with mint leaves for luck. Every region had a variation. In some places, patients drank the leftover vinegar after treatment just to be sure. Modern interpretations vary. Vinegar does have mild antiseptic properties, and mustard, when applied topically, can stimulate circulation. Some modern naturopaths even suggest similar methods for muscle aches or colds. But in medieval times, the line between treatment and ordeal was blurrier. Was the fever retreating, or were you simply too exhausted to notice? Surviving journals from patients described the process as unpleasant but clarifying. A 15th century woman in York wrote that after a mustard rap, she dreamt of walking through a boiling meadow and awoke with no fever. Another claimed the socks gave her visions of saints, though she later admitted she may have dozed off beside a candle. Researchers continue to debate whether the efficacy lay in the ingredients or the ritual. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. There is no single explanation that satisfies all the records. So, you lie there wrapped like a parcel of steamed vegetables, wondering if vinegar and mustard are truly helping, or if they're just what hope happened to smell like that night. And now, perhaps the most squirm-worthy of all the mouse. Not a metaphorical one. a real dead mouse ground, seasoned and pressed directly against your aching tooth. If you think that sounds like a rodent-themed nightmare, well, welcome to the reality of medieval dentistry. You recline open-mouthed as a village healer leans over you with a look of grim determination. She unwraps a pouch from her belt and reveals the flattened remains of a tiny mouse. It's dry, lightly dusted with crushed herbs, probably sage, perhaps mint. She murmurs something about the pain retreating like a mouse from a cat, then applies the paste directly to your gums. You wince. The ache dulls, but not because of the mouse. Toothaches were notorious in medieval Europe. Without modern dental care cavities, abscesses and infections were common and excruciating. Lacking drills or antiseptics, healers turned to symbolism, distraction, and frankly, anything they could find. Enter the mouse. This remedy had multiple variants. In some regions, the mouse was roasted first, then ground with sage onion and occasionally honey to form a thick paste. In others, it was fermented slightly before use. No, that doesn't make it better. The concoction was applied directly to the gums, sometimes wrapped in cloth, other times just shoved under the lip like medieval chewing tobacco. There are theories, of course. Mice were seen as quick, clever, and slightly magical. In folklore, they could steal illness or pain by proximity. Some believed that applying a mouse, especially one that died quietly or willingly, could transfer the ache out of your mouth and into the earth. Others thought the strong smell and unpleasant texture simply distracted the brain from the throb beneath your molars. One 14th century herbal guide from the Low Countries recommends using a white mouse for best effect, ideally one found in the pantry and unspoiled by trap. Another English folk recipe includes mouse cloves and a pinch of salt, declaring it fit for noble mouths. Try not to laugh or gag. Some scholars argue this was more about desperation than design. A toothache, after all, can drive even the proudest noble to whimper. In the absence of options, even a dead mouse starts to look like a solution. There is no scholarly consensus on whether the mouse's biology played any role or whether it was simply a grim placebo, aided by ritual and belief. Rural communities, particularly in colder regions where tooth pain worsened with winter damp, passed these recipes down like family secrets. Some even paired them with chants or charms, whispering old rhymes to lull the pain away. You sit quietly now, the taste of sage and something distinctly rodent lingering on your tongue. The healer nods satisfied. Maybe you feel better, maybe not. But in that quiet cottage with herbs drying above and snow tapping at the shutters, even a mouse could be a miracle, or at least a distraction. And sometimes distraction is the only medicine you need. By now, you may think nothing could be worse than a mouse paste, but hold your nose because pig dung is next. That's right. Medieval Europe's answer to baldness involves slathering your scalp in something you'd usually step around in the street. Desperate times, desperate textures. Imagine sitting on a wooden stool in a monastic infirmary while a novice monk approaches holding a bowl of what looks like overcooked porridge and smells like a barnyard in July. He smiles reassuringly. You balding and increasingly hopeless brace yourself. The mixture is lukewarm, and yes, it squelches. The logic has always followed a curious path. Pig dung, often fresh but occasionally dried and rehydrated, was believed to activate the scalp. The heat ammonia and texture were thought to stimulate follicles much like tilling soil before planting. Some monks even compared the scalp to a field barren without proper nourishment. Pig dung, rich in earth energy, offered that fertility. It wasn't just monks. Nobles, merchants, and even scholars turned to this malodorous mask in pursuit of flowing locks. Recipes varied, some mixed pig dung with onion juice, others with rosemary and lard. A particularly ambitious version from 15th century Bavaria included egg yolk and crushed pearl, because why not aim high while smelling low? The mixture was applied in thick layers and left on overnight. Heads were then wrapped in linen and sometimes gently warmed by the hearth. In the morning, the hair was rinsed usually with vinegar or rose water to no great olfactory success. There are shockingly records of people swearing by it. A Milanese courtier wrote in his diary that he regained the crown of youth after 3 weeks of dung treatments. Whether this was placebo coincidence or the result of something else entirely, no one knows. There is no scholarly consensus on whether pig dung ever helped hair grow, or if the sheer embarrassment of smelling like a sty kept people indoors long enough for their scalp to rest. The real question, perhaps, is why it persisted. Baldness in the medieval world wasn't just cosmetic, it carried social weight. A full head of hair implied youth strength, even virility. Monks shaved theirs by design, but laymen often equated baldness with decay. So, it's no wonder that even pig dung became a beacon of hope. Some remedies even claimed to prevent future baldness if applied before the hairline receded. These were marketed heavily in urban centers. One London apothecary reportedly offered a porcine paste for gentlemen of diminishing fortitude. It sold out regularly. Modern dermatologists understandably do not recommend this approach. Still, the idea of nourishing the scalp through organic means hasn't fully died. Even today, some natural treatments contain urea, an ingredient found in animal waste, though under much more refined circumstances. So, you sit there, scalp, warm, dignity dampened. The room is quiet save for the crackling of the hearth and the faint rustle of someone giggling behind a curtain. It may not be the most flattering cure, but in an age before Rogaine, a little barnyard alchemy seemed better than nothing. Now let's soothe that indignity with something almost cozy goose grease. Yes, actual rendered goose fat. Thick, warm, and with a vaguely poultry perfume, this medieval staple was rubbed across chests, backs, and throats to treat coughs and chills. And for once it didn't involve rodents or feces. Picture a child tucked beneath heavy wool blankets, coughing in a drafty cottage. A grandmother pulls a small crock from the hearth, its contents pale, oily, and fragrant with rosemary. She dips her fingers in and begins massaging the child's chest, murmuring old lullabies between applications. The room smells like roast dinner and pine needles. Oddly, it's not unpleasant. Goose grease was considered one of the more reliable home remedies for respiratory ailments. Unlike other animal-based treatments, it didn't rely on symbolism or fantasy. It simply worked, at least sometimes. Applied warm, it helped retain body heat, soothe the skin, and created a barrier against cold air. Think of it as medieval Vicks Vapo Rub, without the menthol, but with a side of stuffing. Households often kept jars of goose grease on hand, especially during winter. It was gathered during slaughter season, rendered carefully, and stored in cool cellars. Some versions were plain, others were infused with herbs like sage thyme or mustard seed. The grease was rubbed on the chest, then covered with linen or wool to lock in the warmth. A warm compress might follow, or a cup of honeyed wine. One particularly beloved variation involved combining goose grease with beeswax and lavender, creating a salve that hardened slightly in cooler temperatures and could be reheated when needed. Not just for children, this remedy was also used by farmers, monks, and elderly villagers who battled long, damp winters with aching lungs. Some historians suggest that this treatment may have had real thermal benefits. Fat conducts heat slowly, so it could help maintain warmth on the skin's surface. Others point to the psychological comfort being cared for, gently rubbed, tucked in by firelight. Scholars continue to debate whether any antibacterial effects were present, but few deny its cultural value. There's a charming account from a 15th century Welsh family manual that reads, "When the cold doth rattle the chest, like a clumsy drummer, bring forth the goose and smooth the breath." Whether the cure worked or not, it clearly brought comfort. Even today, echoes of this remedy remain. Some rural traditions still reference goose fat rubs as a nostalgic if outdated winter treatment. The idea of warming the body externally to fight internal illness hasn't gone away. It's just been modernized, sterilized, and packaged in plastic tubes. So, as you lie beneath a heavy quilt, your chest slicked in golden salve and your breath slowly easing, it's easy to see why this remedy endured. It didn't ask you to believe in magic or endure humiliation. It just wrapped you in warmth, reminded you someone cared, and gave your lungs a little peace. And sometimes, that's all healing needs to begin. Your chest still faintly gleaming with goose grease, we now step into the gilded world of hearts, where the cure for weakness wasn't warmth or rest, but gold. Real gold. Flaked, powdered, or distilled, this rare metal was once ingested to fortify the heart. No, not metaphorically. They literally ate gold. You sit in the candlelit hall of a wealthy merchant's home. On the table before you, a chalice glints in the firelight. The drink within is ruby-colored wine, but floating on top, thin, shimmering flecks of beaten gold. You lift it to your lips. It tastes metallic, decadent, and oddly cold. The apothecary watches you closely, murmuring that strength will return soon. It always does, he says after gold. The theory behind this luminous remedy was twofold. First, gold was incorruptible. It didn't tarnish, decay, or change. Surely ingesting a little would lend similar qualities to the body, especially the heart believed to be the source of both emotion and vitality. Second, gold's association with sunlight and divinity gave it spiritual heft. It was thought to carry divine energy capable of lifting melancholy and reviving sluggish blood. Recipes varied. Some involved dissolving gold leaf in vinegar or citrus juice and mixing it into wine. Others called for heating gold with herbs to infuse its essence. A few ambitious alchemists claimed to distill a gold elixir that could grant long life, if not immortality. None succeeded, but many profited. This wasn't just a curiosity of the nobility. Gold-infused tonics were sold in medieval markets touted as heart tonics, mood lifters, and energy restorers. In Renaissance Italy, one blend called aurum potabile, literally drinkable gold, became something of a craze. Apothecaries wrote poems about its beauty. Courtiers passed it around at parties. Some scholars argue that these treatments were more placebo than potion. Gold, being inert, has no known therapeutic effect when consumed in tiny amounts. But the ritual of drinking something so rare, so expensive, could certainly make someone feel special, stronger, braver, temporarily transformed. There is no scholarly consensus on whether the effect was physical, emotional, or entirely imagined. Interestingly, gold was often paired with herbs known to have mild stimulants like saffron or cinnamon, so the drink may have actually produced a short-lived lift in mood or heart rate. But the gold itself, mostly show. Still, the symbolism endured. Kings and queens included gold in their personal tonics. Wealthy merchants swore by it. Physicians wrote of patients who felt elevated after consumption. And in many ways, it wasn't about the result. It was about the statement, I value my life enough to gild it. So, as the chalice touches your lips again, and the metallic taste lingers on your tongue, you wonder, was this ever about healing? Or was it a golden placebo, a gleaming performance of hope in the face of fatigue? Either way, your heart beats a little faster. Whether from the wine, the ritual, or the gold, you'll never quite know. Now let's drop some brains into the mix owl brains, to be exact. Not to eat, but to drip into your eyes. You're seated under a flickering lantern, while a robed healer gently tilts your head back. He murmurs about night vision and wisdom, then reaches for a tiny jar. Inside, a grayish mixture of boiled owl brain and water, carefully strained. With steady hands, he tips a dropper. Blink. You've just entered one of the strangest chapters in medieval optometry. This was not a fringe practice. Boiled owl brain eye drops were believed to enhance night vision, a practical advantage in times when candlelight was expensive and moonlight unreliable. Owls, after all, see in the dark, so it stood to reason by the logic of sympathetic magic that their eyes or brains might pass along that gift, if carefully applied. One popular recipe called for harvesting the brain of a barn owl at twilight, boiling it in rainwater until the mixture turned milky, then letting it cool overnight. In the morning, the solution was strained through linen and stored in small ceramic flasks. A few drops per eye before dusk was the recommended dose. Some healers added chamomile or honey to ease the sting. Others insisted it worked best on nights with a full moon. The practice was most common in rural areas, especially among hunters' guards and night watchmen. Some claimed it improved their vision. Others simply enjoyed the ritual, a strange comfort before stepping into the shadows. Records from northern France, parts of Germany, and even early Islamic medical texts reference similar concoctions, though with regional variations. Surviving illustrations depict traveling apothecaries advertising these vision elixirs in crowded markets, sometimes holding tiny cages with live owls to prove authenticity. A 14th century English herbal notes, good for seeing in poor candle or against moon fog, use not daily, lest the eyes begin to dream. Modern medicine predictably finds no scientific basis for the treatment. Owl brains contain no known compounds that improve human vision. Historians still argue whether the real power lay in ritual placebo or sheer desperation. And yet, the tradition lingered. Even after eyeglasses became more common in elite circles, folk remedies like this one remained in practice for centuries. There's something oddly poetic about it, isn't there? The idea that wisdom and clarity might be passed on through the very organ of a creature known for silence and sight. In a world dimly lit and full of unseen dangers, people wanted more than just light. They wanted assurance. So, you sit back blinking slowly as the mixture seeps into your eyes. The world doesn't sharpen exactly, but the night seems less daunting. There's a quiet confidence, a sense that maybe you're not walking into the dark entirely alone. Whether science agrees or not, one thing is certain in medieval medicine. Belief often did the heavy lifting, and owls in life and lore were always watching. Now, imagine your skin stitched shut with wax, not thread. You lie on a narrow bed as a healer leans over you, ladle in hand. From a small iron pot, he pours a warm, golden stream onto your wounded arm. It hardens slowly, forming a glossy shell. This isn't candle making, it's a beeswax bandage, and it just might be the most practical idea in this entire medieval medicine cabinet. Unlike many of the animal-themed remedies we've explored, beeswax treatments had a basis that feels oddly modern. Softened wax, especially when mixed with olive oil or herbal infusions, created a flexible seal over cuts, blisters, and abrasions. It helped keep out dirt and moisture, retained warmth, and allowed for gentle movement. In an era without gauze, antiseptic, or surgical tape, beeswax was the duct tape of healing. You flex your wrist. The wax bends slightly pliable and warm. It smells faintly of honey and rosemary. There's something comforting in its simplicity. Not squirmy, not slimy, just clean, natural, and surprisingly effective. The recipe usually started with raw beeswax, gently melted over low heat. Some healers added crushed herbs, lavender comfrey, or thyme believed to reduce inflammation. Others infused the wax with resin or oil of myrrh for added antiseptic qualities. Once melted and combined, the mixture was cooled just enough to avoid burns, then poured or brushed directly onto the skin. It formed a thin layer that hardened as it cooled, locking in whatever was beneath. A 12th century text from Salerno described beeswax bandages as nature's skin, bestowed upon the wounded by the labor of honest insects. That same manuscript warns not to overheat the wax, lest the patient feel the sting of the bee twice. Unlike remedies involving skull dust or hedgehogs, beeswax rarely drew skepticism. It was used by monks, midwives, battlefield surgeons, and herbalists across regions and centuries. Surviving medical kits from medieval France and England almost always contain wax pellets or wrapped blocks. Some were even scented with rose or mint, a rare intersection of function and fragrance. Modern researchers believe this treatment may have offered real antibacterial benefits thanks to the protective seal and possible inclusion of herbs with natural antimicrobial properties. More importantly, it kept wounds covered clean and somewhat insulated, crucial in preventing infection. There is broad scholarly agreement that this remedy, unlike many others, likely did more good than harm. Even today, beeswax appears in modern salves, balms, and skincare products. Its legacy lives on not as superstition, but as testament to early trial and error. In a world filled with speculative cures, beeswax stands out as a quiet success story. So, you lie still, your arm encased in golden calm, the flicker of firelight glinting off the cooling surface. It's a small comfort, but a real one. In this chapter of bizarre treatments and desperate hopes, the bees got something right. Sometimes healing isn't about drama. Sometimes it's just warmth wax and the hum of something ancient doing its job. A pot bubbles quietly over the hearth, filling the room with a grassy damp aroma. Inside, snails, yes, snails slowly dissolve into tonic. No shells, just the slick, pale bodies, boiled and filtered into something you're meant to drink. The promise. Calm nerves, steady breath, and peaceful sleep. Welcome to snail water. You glance at the cup in your hand. It's warm, faintly green, and smells faintly of mint. Or is that just wishful thinking? The healer nods, gently encouraging you to sip. It's not pleasant, but it's not revolting either. Just odd. A liquid version of silence. Snail water had surprising reach in medieval and early modern medicine. Originally a folk remedy, it gained traction among monastic orders, apothecaries, and even the aristocracy. The core idea, snails as creatures of extreme slowness and stillness, symbolized tranquility. They lived in moist, dark places, unbothered by the outside world. Some believed that drinking them would imbue a person with those same calming traits. Early recipes were simple: gather snails at dawn, preferably after a rain. Remove the shells, wash the bodies in vinegar, then boil them with chamomile, lavender, and sometimes lettuce or hyssop. After straining the broth, the liquid could be drunk warm or cold. Some variations included wine. Others added honey to mask the texture, because yes, it was a bit slimy. Nuns in several English convents reportedly used snail water as part of evening prayer rituals. The tonics were taken before vespers to calm anxious minds and steady breathing for long chants. One abbess even wrote that it helped with the unrest of spinning thoughts. Snail water was also offered to nervous children, expectant mothers, and the grief-stricken. It became known in some places as stillness in a cup. While modern science doesn't support snails as a direct sedative, some of the added herbs like lavender, lemon balm, and chamomile do have calming properties. It's possible that the snail base simply offered a neutral, protein-rich liquid to carry those effects. Scholars continue to debate whether the snails themselves contributed anything beyond symbolism. Still, it was the symbolism that mattered. Drinking snail water wasn't just about chemical reaction. It was about ritual. Slow brewing, quiet, sipping breath, drawn in and held. The act of making the tonic was as calming as the drink itself. And in a world where nerves were blamed for everything from seizures to fainting spells, any remedy that soothed the spirit was worth a try. Some apothecaries even sold bottled versions with beautiful labels, painted snails gliding across fields of lavender, their slow trails marked with stars. A few were mixed with gold leaf for high-end customers, giving them a sparkle that seemed to promise divine calm. You finish the cup slowly. The taste lingers herbal, earthy, oddly soft. Your shoulders loosen. Maybe it's the warmth. Maybe it's the story. Or maybe in a world of noise and haste, sipping something made from the slowest creature alive is its own kind of medicine. And now, as the fire dims and your mind drifts, we arrive at the final question: which of these strange, slimy, and often smelly remedies actually worked? Which healed, which harmed, and which merely comforted the afflicted while doing nothing at all? You lean back on the straw mattress, your body wrapped in wax, feathers, grease, and possibly still a hint of mouse. Around you, clay pots glimmer with the remains of fox lungs, snail water, and powdered skull. Somewhere, a hedgehog may still be smoldering. It's a lot to take in, but also a testament to human creativity in the face of suffering. Medical historians often tread cautiously when judging the past. Some remedies like beeswax bandages or moldy bread may have had genuine healing power. Others like pig dung or owl eye drops likely offered no benefit beyond ritual comfort. Still others like gold leaf or skull powder blur the line between medicine and meaning. What's clear is that medieval people weren't foolish. They were observant, resourceful, and above all, hopeful. They watched, they tested, they whispered through generations. A remedy that calmed one child might be used again for another. And if something didn't kill you, and maybe even seemed to help it, became part of the healer's toolkit. This was medicine not built on peer review, but on memory and faith. Some modern scholars argue that the placebo effect played a powerful role. In the absence of anesthesia, antibiotics, or sterile environments, belief itself may have eased pain or calmed panic. When a trusted healer rubbed goose grease on your chest or poured snail tonic into your cup, that moment of care might have done more than the mixture ever could. Others suggest that symbolism and metaphor filled the gaps that science couldn't yet reach. If foxes were clever and quick, why shouldn't their lungs help you breathe? If gold was incorruptible, couldn't it strengthen your heart? There is no consensus on where belief ended and biology began. And perhaps that's the real message hidden in this bizarre apothecary of history. That medicine in every era is as much about the story we tell ourselves as it is about the chemicals in the bottle. That healing often begins not with a cure, but with a ritual, with someone sitting beside you, lighting a candle and saying, "Try this, it might help." Tonight you've wandered through powdered bone-roasted lizard vinegar socks and snail broth, not for shock or shame, but to understand. To see that even the strangest treatments came from a place of deep longing, to help, to soothe, to survive. So as you close your eyes, remember this. Your ancestors fought hard for their health. Sometimes they got it wrong, sometimes they got lucky. But always they tried. And in the quiet spaces between fever dreams and fox lung tea, they left behind not just cures but stories. The fire is just embers now, and the night has softened. Around you, the jars and bundles of old remedies seem less absurd, more tender. They're the traces of people doing their best with what they had. If this tale helped you rest tonight, drop your time and city in the comments, and maybe tell me which of these medieval remedies would you actually try,